The canopy of the Borneo rainforest is a tapestry of suffocating greens, a place where light struggles to touch the earth, and where silence is merely an illusion created by the overlapping layers of 1,000 hidden lives. For Ghost, the silence was absolute. He was a creature of paradox, an albino orangutan in a world designed for shadows and dappled light. His fur, a shocking ghostly white, was a beacon in the deep emerald gloom, a target for every predator and a mark of shame among his own kind. He had been abandoned by his mother in the earliest weeks of his life, cast aside because his lack of pigment signaled sickness, a curse that set him apart. Now, at 7 years old, Ghost lived in the hollow of a rotting ironwood tree, a sanctuary that felt more like a tomb. He was thin, his ribs tracing a fragile map against his pale, translucent skin. Every movement was a chore. The tropical humidity, which usually hummed with life, felt like a heavy blanket pressing against his lungs. He had learned the language of the forest, the sharp bark of a macaque, the low vibration of a distant storm, the snap of a twig that meant danger, but he could never speak it back. He was the anomaly, the creature that the forest tried to ignore. His days were spent in a dull, rhythmic cycle of hunger and listlessness, moving only when the gnawing in his stomach became sharp enough to force him down toward the lower branches to scavenge for bitter fruit. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He didn't even know if he was waiting for anything. The world was shrinking for Ghost. The world outside his tree felt too loud, too bright, and too hostile. He had forgotten the touch of another hand, the warmth of another body. He had only the moss-covered walls of his hollow and the distant, mocking calls of the gibbons at dawn. One Tuesday, when the monsoon rains had turned the forest floor into a sludge of decaying leaves and mud, Ghost felt a shift in the air. It wasn't the smell of rain or the approach of a leopard. It was a scent he hadn't encountered in his living memory, the smell of aged, dry wood, something that didn't belong to the wet, rot-filled heart of this jungle. He pulled himself to the edge of his hollow, his milky blue eyes squinting against the harsh, vertical shafts of light that broke through the canopy. Below him, struggling to navigate the treacherous, mud-slicked roots of a giant banyan tree, was another orangutan. This one was old, impossibly old. His hair was a coarse, tangled mess of copper and gray, matted with mud, and he moved with a slow, deliberate cadence that betrayed an injury in his left hip. He was dragging a heavy, splintered piece of driftwood, a relic that looked like it had traveled miles to reach this specific, forgotten grove. Ghost should have retreated. That was his rule. If you see them, hide. If they see you, run. But the old ape stopped, tilted his head, and let out a sound that wasn't a roar of aggression or a plea for food. It was a low, melodic hum, a vibration that resonated in Ghost's chest. The stranger looked up, his deep amber eyes locking onto the pale, shivering figure in the tree hollow. There was no judgment in that stare, no recoil at the sight of the white fur, just a long, steady observation. The stranger dropped the piece of driftwood, sat down in the mud, and began to groom his own hand, completely unbothered by the torrential downpour. He stayed there for hours, a statue of patience, inviting the silence to settle between them. For the first time in his life, Ghost didn't feel like a ghost. He felt seen. The rain hammered against the leaves, a relentless percussion that usually sent Ghost retreating into the deepest corner of his hollow. But today, he stayed at the threshold. He watched the old orangutan, whom he would come to know as Silas, anchor himself to the base of the banyan tree. Silas didn't try to climb. He didn't issue the territorial warnings that Ghost had learned to fear from the rare patrols of the younger males in the area. Instead, Silas reached into a fold of his matted fur and produced a handful of damp, hard-shelled nuts, cracking them with a slow, methodical precision that spoke of decades of survival. He didn't eat them all. He placed 3 of them on a flat, protruding root that spiraled away from the tree, directly in line with Ghost's perch. Then, Silas leaned back against the trunk, closed his eyes, and exhaled a long, rattling breath that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 miles. It was a clear invitation, an offering stripped of all ceremony. Ghost's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, a calculated lure to draw him out into the open where he would be exposed and vulnerable. But hunger was a physical ache that blurred his judgment. and a deeper, more primal desire for connection tugged at his limbs. He descended, moving with the jerky, hesitant grace of a ghost, his white limbs stark against the dark, wet bark. He kept his eyes locked on Silas, ready to bolt at the slightest twitch of a muscle. But the old ape remained statue still. When Ghost reached the root, he snatched the nuts with trembling fingers and scrambled back a few feet, retreating to the safety of a lower branch. Silas didn't follow. He simply opened one eye, let out a soft, guttural huff that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle, and resumed his grooming. Over the next few days, the dynamic shifted in a way that defied the brutal logic of the forest. Silas became a fixture beneath the banyan tree, and Ghost, against every warning his survival instincts hissed in his ear, began to descend earlier and earlier. Silas was not a teacher in the traditional sense. He didn't show Ghost how to fight or how to patrol. He was a master of stillness. He taught Ghost how to identify the subtle vibrations of the forest, the way the wind changed just before a leopard lunged, the precise pattern of falling leaves that signaled a heavy storm. Yet, there was a secret hidden in Silas's movement. When he groomed his hip, his hands lingered on a jagged, puckered scar that looked remarkably like the aftermath of a poacher's snare. And every night, when the moon hung high and silver, Silas would take that same piece of driftwood he had dragged with him and trace patterns in the mud, not random scratches, but deliberate, repetitive arcs. One evening, as a golden, bruising sunset painted the canopy in shades of fire, Ghost climbed down to find Silas in a state of distress. The old ape was panting, his chest heaving, and he was clutching his side. The arrogance of the forest had caught up to him. He was no longer the steady, unmoving anchor. He was fading. Ghost felt a surge of panic that was entirely new. For the first time in his life, he felt the terrifying, sharp edge of empathy. He didn't want the silence to return. He didn't want to be a ghost again. He reached out, his pale, long-fingered hand hovering tentatively over Silas's shoulder, before finally making contact with the coarse, matted hair. It was the first time in 7 years that Ghost had touched another living soul. The warmth of it surged through him like an electric shock. Silas looked up, his amber eyes clouded but clear in their intent, and he grabbed Ghost's wrist with a grip that was surprisingly firm. He pointed toward the deep, northern thickets, a place where the map of their home grew wild and untamed, and let out a sharp, urgent sequence of sounds. He was passing something on, not just knowledge, but a direction. The urgency in Silas's eyes was like a physical weight, pressing into Ghost's own frantic pulse. The elder didn't just want to be understood. He was initiating a transition. He pulled Ghost closer, his gnarled fingers pressing into the white skin of Ghost's forearm, tracing a path that led not toward the familiar, sun-drenched canopy, but deeper into the dark, tangled labyrinth of the northern valley. It was a region of the forest that Ghost had always avoided, a place where the trees grew too close together and the ground was a treacherous carpet of shadow. Silas gestured toward the driftwood he had been guarding so fiercely. With a grunt of exertion, he shoved it toward Ghost. It wasn't just a piece of debris. There were marks on it, deep, gouged-out notches that shimmered with a strange, sticky resin. As Ghost touched the wood, he felt a strange familiarity. The markings felt like a language he hadn't known he could read. He traced them with his thumb, and suddenly he understood. It was a map, not of the terrain, but of the safety of the trees, a path that bypassed the swampy lowlands where the predators thrived. Silas collapsed back against the banyan, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. He was failing rapidly. The forest around them seemed to quiet in deference, the usual cacophony of the evening dying down into a strained, expectant hum. Ghost realized with a terrifying clarity that this was the end of the old ape's journey and the beginning of his own. He looked at the northern thicket, then back at Silas. The elder shook his head, a final, weary gesture, and closed his eyes. He wasn't going. He was the anchor, and he had tethered his life to this spot to ensure Ghost had the strength to move on. Ghost did something he had never done. He groomed the old ape. He picked the leaves and twigs from the thick, matted copper fur, his movements desperate and tender, trying to offer back a fraction of the peace Silas had given him. He stayed until the last of the light bled out of the sky, until the forest was bathed in the cold, blue silence of night. When Silas stopped breathing, not with a struggle but with a final, long exhale, Ghost didn't shriek. He didn't run. He sat there, a white statue in the dark, feeling the life drain out of the space between them. He realized then that his whiteness, his curse, had never been about being a target. It had been about being a beacon. Silas had found him not by accident, but by design. He had been looking for a successor, someone to carry the memory of the herd that had been scattered, someone to keep the old ways alive in the quiet, dark corners of the world. Ghost stood up, his joints aching, his heart heavy but strangely expanded. He picked up the piece of driftwood, now his most precious possession. He cast one last glance at the silent, still body at the base of the banyan, and then, without looking back, he turned toward the north. He moved with a newfound purpose, his white fur catching the stray moonlight, glowing like a spirit moving through the gloom. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was traveling, and for the first time, he knew exactly where he was going. The forest, once a prison, was now a map, and the ghost, for the first time, was alive. The journey into the north was a brutal trial by fire. The forest here was ancient, choked with towering ironwoods and vines that seemed to coil like serpents, waiting for a misplaced step. Ghost moved with the caution of a creature who had lived his entire life in hiding, yet the map, the gouged, resin-scented driftwood, pulsed with an undeniable clarity in his grip. Every time the path forked, he would press his thumb against the notches, reading the history Silas had carved into the wood. It was a memory of a lineage, of territories once held by families that had since been shattered by the encroaching silence of the modern world. 3 days into his trek, Ghost encountered the first obstacle, a wide, rushing ravine where a bridge of woven branches had long since collapsed into the churning water below. He froze. His instinct was to curl into a ball, to wait, to exist in the paralysis that had defined his first 7 years. But he felt the weight of the wood against his chest. He heard, in the back of his mind, the guttural, encouraging huff of his mentor. Ghost approached the edge, his white fur rippling like smoke in the damp breeze. He didn't jump. He calculated. He watched the sway of the hanging vines, noting how the strongest ones held fast even against the relentless tug of the stream. With a burst of strength he didn't know he possessed, he leaped, catching a vine that swung him across the chasm in a wide, heart-stopping arc. He landed on the other side, not with the grace of a predator, but with the desperate, triumphant scramble of a survivor who had finally tasted the thrill of autonomy. As he ventured deeper, the forest changed. The air grew thinner, cleaner, and the oppressive rot of the lowlands gave way to the sharp, sweet scent of highland flora. It was here that he began to see signs of others. Not the fearful, scattered apes he was used to, but intentional markings, deep, vertical gashes on the trunks of trees, and woven nests tucked high into the canopy, safe from the prowling dangers of the ground. His pulse quickened. He wasn't just following a map, he was following a trail of ghosts. One afternoon, while perched high in the branches of a giant fig tree, Ghost heard a sound that made his fur stand on end. It wasn't the scream of a macaque or the howl of a gibbon. It was a rhythmic, thumping sound, a fist hitting a hollow trunk. Then, a response, another thud, closer, sharper. It was a conversation, a language of location and intent. Ghost waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, until a silhouette appeared in the canopy above. It was a female, her fur thick and healthy, her eyes alert. She paused, her gaze sweeping the area, and then she saw him. She didn't flee, she didn't attack. She froze, her eyes widening as they landed on the impossible sight of a snow-white ape sitting in the green heart of the highland. She tilted her head, a gesture so profoundly reminiscent of Silas that a sob caught in Ghost's throat. She reached out, grasping a branch, and let out a soft, inquiring whistle. Ghost clutched the piece of driftwood to his chest. He realized then that Silas hadn't just saved him from an isolated death. He had led him home to a remnant of their kind that still remembered how to survive together. He stood, his white silhouette striking against the deep, verdant leaves, and for the first time, he didn't lower his gaze. He didn't shrink away. He let out a low, resonant hum, the same vibration Silas had shared with him on that first rainy Tuesday. The female's shoulders relaxed, She gestured for him to follow, moving into the deeper, denser canopy. Ghost followed, leaving the isolation of his hollow behind, stepping into a future that, until now, he hadn't even dared to imagine. The transition into the fold was not immediate. The community, a tight-knit family of 7, was wary. They were creatures of habit and deep-seated caution, having spent generations hiding from the encroaching shadows of humanity. When Ghost first appeared in their midst, his striking, snow-white coat was initially met with alarm. They chattered, circled him, and inspected him with the suspicious intensity of wild animals. But Ghost possessed something the others did not: the driftwood, and with it, the ancient, rhythmic signals that Silas had taught him. He showed them the carvings. When he held the wood, he didn't just show them the notches. He mimicked the movements, the specific melodic pulses that Silas had used to communicate across the distance. A collective hush fell over the group. The elder of their family, a scarred, stoic male named Kyle, approached him. Kyle touched the wood, his long, leathery fingers tracing the same grooves that Silas had carved years ago. The recognition was visceral. It was a bridge between the living and the lost, a piece of ancestral history that confirmed Ghost's place among them. Ghost was no longer the outcast in a hollow. He was a carrier of a legacy. He began to learn the true language of the forest, not just the survival instincts of a solitary survivor, but the complex, nuanced interplay of a community. He learned the roles: the scouts who kept watch for the distant, metallic roar of logging machinery, the nurturers who maintained the hidden gardens of wild fruit, and the protectors who navigated the complex geography of the northern valleys to keep the family safe. His whiteness, once his shame, became a symbol of his identity. He became their pathfinder. In the thick, suffocating twilight of the forest floor, his pale coat was a beacon that the others followed. He led them through terrain that no one else could navigate, his instincts sharpened by the years he had spent alone, forced to read the nuances of the trees where others had simply relied on the herd. He felt the shift within himself. The hunger that had once been a gnawing ache was replaced by a sense of belonging that was both grounding and expansive. But the forest was changing. The distant mechanical rumbles grew louder, and the canopy grew thinner as the edges of their territory began to vanish. Tension mounted within the group. The days of simple survival were ending. They were entering an era of endurance. Kyle, feeling the weight of the encroaching threat, turned to Ghost. He looked at the younger ape, now strong and sure of his place, and handed him the responsibility of the next movement. One night, as the air grew heavy with the threat of heavy machinery nearby, Ghost stood at the edge of the highest canopy. He looked out over the expanse of the valley, a vast, dark ocean of leaves that was slowly being consumed by the encroaching industrial decay. He knew what he had to do. The family had to move deeper, past the familiar boundaries of their ancestral home, into the uncharted, treacherous mountains where the machines could not follow. He turned to the group. He didn't use a roar or a cry. He used the rhythm, a sharp, deliberate series of thuds on the trunk, mirroring the call to travel that Silas had once given him. His family gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the pale light of the moon, reflecting off his white fur. They were scared, but they were ready. He held the driftwood high, not as a relic of the past, but as a compass for their future. As they began the arduous climb toward the high, jagged peaks, Ghost didn't look back at the dying woods below. He looked forward, into the rising mist of the mountains, leading his family toward a place where they could live without the shadow of fear. The ascent was brutal. Cold winds bit at their skin, and the terrain was a maze of jagged rock and sparse, freezing vegetation. But Ghost was tireless. He felt the spirit of Silas in every step he took, a guiding pressure against his back. They climbed until the trees ended and the sky opened up, vast and terrifyingly clear. When they finally crested the highest ridge, they looked down into a valley that had never been touched, a paradise of lush, untouched growth, shielded by the sheer walls of the mountains. Ghost reached the peak, his white fur glowing in the early morning light. He stood for a long moment, the driftwood finally discarded, its purpose served. He was no longer a ghost in the shadows, he was a leader in the sunlight. His family arrived at his side, huddling together in the warmth of the rising sun. They had found their sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world could never reach them. As he watched his kin settle into the new, vibrant landscape, Ghost felt a peace so profound, it silenced the last echoes of his loneliness. He had finally arrived.